Today I'm speaking with Kevin Elliott, author of the book Democracy for Busy People. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kevin, what inspired you to write this book and why were busy people the focus?
The book is dedicated to my mother. My mother is a single working parent without a college degree. She's the kind of person who had a lot of things on her plate. At any given time, she had to go to work. She had to maintain the household. She had to take care of me. For much of her life, you would have described her as like not a very good democratic citizen. She didn't really pay attention. She maybe voted once every decade. Really was struggled to understand what politics was about. As a matter of fact, there are survey evidence, science evidence. We see that there are millions and millions of people who are like my mother in this position of being too busy with the daily demands of life to prioritize politics. And what I was looking to do in my book is to try to think through what would we need to do to make a democracy that truly empowered, gave a place to people like my mother was when I was a child, and thinking this through both in terms of political ideas. How do we need to change our expectations for what makes a good democratic citizen? What does it mean? What does it look like to be a good democratic citizen? And also how to rethink our democratic institutions. What kinds of institutions do we want? What kinds of reforms do we want to think about and emphasize in order to empower people like her?
And can you give an example of how changes in voting laws, for example, registration or voting by mail, disproportionately affect busy people?
So, for instance, registration in the United States. Registration is the obligation or the responsibility of individual citizens. So if I want to register to vote, that's up to me. This is not that common in other advanced democracies. In other countries, the essentially the electoral authority will register you to vote automatically. The local government has your information. They know where you live because of tax records and other kinds of records, and they will automatically register you to vote. The fact that in the United States that responsibility is put on individual citizens, that makes it a bit harder to vote. When you think about how deciding who to vote for, deciding whether to vote, those are two different decisions. Registration adds yet another decision, yet another point of friction. In recent years, states like Georgia and Florida have changed their laws regarding registration, changing the date by which people have to register to vote. In the state of Florida, if you wanted to vote absentee, previously you were able to register once, and that would allow you to vote absentee for a number of elections. And in 2021, a law changed that so that you have to re-register for every election. So if you just think about the number of times that you're having to think about the basic rules of voting to access your fundamental right to participate in our democracy, it raises the inconvenience. This is a very small change that can just push, right? Those marginal citizens, those people who are most struggling to be active citizens, can just push them a little bit out of the electorate. One other example, which we saw in the state of North Carolina and some other states, they moved polling places away from places where people were traditionally familiar with voting. So, for instance, college campuses in the state of North Carolina had polling places, and then these were moved off of the college campuses, requiring them to leave the place where all of the other things that they do on a day-to-day basis, right, on the campus, moving it away from there, increasing the cost of voting, making it more inconvenient, and shaping the electorate in ways that push, that demobilize busy people, as I say.
Mm-hmm. So, if I'm understanding correctly, inconvenience can be seen as exclusion, whereas inclusion would be making it more convenient. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. When we think about the kinds of most important values that scaffold our democracy, we tend to think about something like equality. But I think it's very important to think about inclusion here, right? You could think about a very, very equal democracy, one where something like maybe the ancient Athenian democracy, where we had a lot of equality. There was a huge amount of ways for people to get their voices heard, but by people, right, we meant a very, very limited group of people, property owning males, right? And so today we recognize that if you had a democracy that was very equal, but extremely exclusionary, we would be very reticent to call that a democracy, at least in any kind of robust way. If we want to think about what an attractive democracy looks like, we need to prioritize inclusion. We need to think about ways that we can make democracy not just technically accessible for people, but in fact, easy and welcoming.
And this is a big question, and we'll get to some of this later as well, but what does it take to create an inclusive democracy?
So I think we also need to look at our democratic institutions to make them welcoming of us and understanding of the demands that we face in other parts of our lives. So just for instance, we should not be voting 4 or 5 times a year. We should be voting no more than once a year. And that election should be on the same day every year, right? That's the kind of reform that would make things simpler and more accessible, because we would have to think about politics less frequently, but it would allow us to focus, right, on those fewer opportunities, and that makes politics more accessible to citizens who are busy. One other institution that I think is very important and Americans tend to be more skeptical about are political parties, because political parties do an enormous service for citizens by making our politics understandable. They will tell us through the media, through advertising, what they think a particular election is about. They will highlight certain issues as being very important. And this helps us as citizens to understand not just that there's an election, but what that election is all about. And that helps politics not just be technically accessible, but be, again, welcoming, because ideally, competitive parties are going to try to provide different pictures of the future, different accounts of where we are today, and what issues are most pressing for us today. And that should bring politics not just to our door, but through our door, basically, right? To make it something that is about us and is about our lives and is about how we want our lives to go.
You talked about standby citizenship, which is a major pillar in your book. How do we combat apathy in voters and help create this standby citizenship?
So how do we combat apathy? I do think one of the things we want to do is we want to try to promote competition in our political system between political parties. In the United States, we have very, very incomplete competition, to put it politely, right? More than 90% of elections for the House of Representatives, for instance, are not at all competitive. No one is in doubt about who's going to win your average House district seat, and that causes a collapse of competition in those districts, because neither side sees a reason to reach out to the people that live there to try to tell them, here's what this election is about. Here's why you should vote. Here's why it's important for you to go out and vote, because everybody knows who's going to win. That is a huge problem. That is a huge problem for democracy. That is a huge problem for democratic inclusion, because if parties aren't reaching out to people, aren't trying to do the hard work of mobilization, then people will fail to see the importance of their vote, will fail to see the importance of what politics has to do with their lives. So I think we do need to try to make sure the competition happens everywhere. One way of doing that would be to create what are called multi-member districts. Not to be too technical, there's a lot of different ways to do this, but for instance, if you had, instead of one representative and you only vote for one representative, what if you vote for one representative, but there's 3 possible seats where you would win? That could be one. Then all a candidate would need would be 33% of the vote instead of 50% plus 1 of the vote when there's only 1 seat. Well, then if you have a district that's 2/3 Democratic, you could get one representative for the citizens there who favor the Republican Party, right? So then you might have two Democratic representatives and one Republican representative, in a state like California where it's very Democratic, and vice versa for Republican-dominated states. Instead of having almost every representative come from one party, right, you could have a more proportional outcome that reflects the diversity of the electorate. And that would give the party in that state, right, the minority party in the state, it would give them some reason to go out and try to mobilize the people who are in that state and explain to them, you've got to come out and vote. We want to hear your voice. You matter. One other place that we would see this in our politics is the Electoral College. Some people say the Electoral College is important because it favors small states. That's not true if you look at what the small states are. Small states are states like Rhode Island, are states like Alaska, are states like Wyoming, are states like Connecticut. These are small states, but they are very firmly in one place or the other. In the most recent presidential election, the competitive states were Pennsylvania and Arizona and Georgia. These are all states in the top 10 states by population. These are large states, right? Because the Electoral College doesn't favor small states, it favors competitive states, of which there are only ever a few. And so those are the only places that presidents will go and visit, top 5 or 6 most competitive states. Every other state is ignored. A national popular vote, for instance, would be a way to make the votes of every American, wherever they live, matter, and that would extend political competition throughout the country, making the election come alive, making it matter, encouraging the parties to reach out to Democrats living in Wyoming and Republicans living in California, of which there are millions.
I always wonder about this when we talk about switching to the popular vote, like what the first election would be like.
I visited this state of North Carolina during the I think it must have been the 2016 election, and it was unreal. There was campaign stuff everywhere, and I whatever state hotel turned on the TV, freaking back to back. And I was like, oh, so this is what it's like when democracy cares about you, basically. It was a very, very surprising, and it was exactly this, what would American politics be like with no Electoral College? You would be bombarded with persuasive messages, for better or worse. I mean, some of these you might think that that's bad, but insofar as our politics stretches for these just interminably long campaign seasons, maybe that would be not a good thing. But if you limited that time, it might be more healthy. I mean, this is how it works again in other countries where you have laws which say the campaign period is 1 month or 60 days or 90 days before the election period. You cannot put political campaigns on television except during that period of time, which is a very interesting thing. It really kind of intensifies the experience of tuning into politics and having the sort of public debate dominated by what's happening in politics. We got to think about this now. We are making a collective decision in the election soon.
And in the book, you talk about mandatory voting and annual elections. Can you tell us a little bit about why these might be the right solutions for our democracy?
When you ask people, do you think it's your duty as a citizen to vote? 90+% of Americans say, yeah, it's my duty to vote. So if we think about busy people, we think about people like my mother, right, who really just didn't have the time. When you're required to do it, right, 2 things happen. One thing, you want to it's actually simpler to turn out to vote than to not turn out to vote. Because if you don't turn out to vote, you're going to get a letter, you're going to get a fine, right? And then that becomes something else that you have to do. It just becomes easier to turn out to vote. So one of the things about mandatory voting, mandatory turnout, is it changes the default, right? What is it easier to do? Is it easier to vote or easier not to vote? And it seems to me that if we want a democracy that truly signals that it cares about everyone's input, that it is going to be inclusive, right? A true sort of a democratic state would signal its belief in the equality of all of its citizens by saying, hey, the default should be that you turn out to vote. Now, if you don't want to vote, if you have some kind of conscientious objection, that's fine. We will send you a letter saying, hey, you didn't vote. Please explain why. Otherwise, we're going to, charge you a fine, $40, something like that. This is how it works in Australia. But by signaling that the default should be that you vote and putting in place an institution that encourages the turnout of everyone, this makes it much easier for busy citizens to turn out. One, because it becomes what's expected of them. And two, there's a coordination point for all of society. We all come to expect that each other will vote. And this can encourage kind of kickoff processes of sort of mass socialization, right? What are we talking about when we get together with our friends and family? When you have mandatory voting, it creates this society-wide expectation that, again, during the period before an election, we're going to give a little bit of thought. We're going to give a little bit of our attention to politics. And so for me, one of the things that mandatory voting it does that is quite valuable for a democracy for busy people is that it just provides this little nudge, this little push, right, towards giving a little bit of our attention to politics and doing the little bit of stepping into politics to vote. Annual elections also have a similar kind of coordinating function. And the idea behind annual elections is that they create this event once a year that helps sync up all of our annual sort of in and out of our life as a society. Many societies have a winter festival. And in the fall, we have a harvest festival. And we have a spring festival. It's called Easter. It's called this, right? And by having annual elections, we allow politics to fall into, fit into that annual calendar that all of us observe together, right, in society.
And Kevin, is there anything else that's important for folks to understand about your book that we didn't get into?
It's important for those of us who do see our calling as citizens as being very important, very urgent, to always remember and try to do what we can, both in our own sort of the use of our voices, to try to remember the people who aren't in the room with us, and to, in our daily lives, try to do what we can to encourage those people, to invite them, to try to paint a picture of why politics is incomplete, why our democracy is impoverished by the absence of those people who aren't in. This is a very important message that everyone who does see politics as an important part of their life, remember the people who aren't there. They also matter. Their voice matters. Their interests matter.
The book is Democracy for Busy People. Kevin Elliott, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for having me.